following program is from NET.
Let the record show that we're continuing the case of City County of Denver versus Lauren Watson. Let the record further show that this trial was started yesterday with the selecting of the jury. The jury was selected but not sworn by last evening when the court adjourned. The jury is presently not in the courtroom. Mr. Davies, I understand you want to make a statement for the record.
Yes, if I may, Your Honor.
We have debated among ourselves whether or not we should waive this jury. If we did so, it would be based entirely upon the proposition that we would rather not have a jury than to lend lip service to the suggestion that this is a jury of Mr. Watson's peers. The times are changing in this country, and the Constitution is a living, viable document. We're convinced that some changes are going to have to be made in jury selection to include more young people, as the people under 30 take up such a more significant portion of the population in this country. People with young and new ideas would have to be included in the panel, not exclusively, but we think there should be some representation. We don't have that in this case. We have exercised our challenges. We have no more. We do not feel it's a jury of our peers. We will accept the jury for the trial of this case, but we want it perfectly clearly understood that we, by doing so, wish it in no way, either through inference or through implication on our part, that we feel this is a jury of our peers, or do we waive any of the objections we have made prior to this time with regard to this particular panel and to this particular jury. Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Davies, the court will note that all your objections stand. Your remarks are on the record for whatever purposes they may be relevant at a later time. And it is the court's understanding that you are, in effect, accepting this jury panel under protest, if you will. If there is nothing further, I will bring the jurors out and have them sworn at this time.
Trial. The City and County of Denver versus Lauren R. Watson.
I'm James Vorenberg. The presentation of evidence itself starts today. The prosecutor puts in his case first, and if, when he is done, he has not presented facts on which the judge thinks the jury could find the defendant guilty, the judge may dismiss the case then and there. The defense would not need to put in any witnesses at all. As the prosecution presents its case through witnesses, the defense has a right at the end of each witness to cross-examine, to try to shake that witness or to get additional information. So in a way, the defense will begin to put its case in here too. It's worth asking whether it gives the prosecutor an advantage to go first. On the one hand, he may be able to convince the jury so well that it cannot be unconvinced. And it's not as though the prosecutor at that point is going to go away. He'll be right there. He can cross-examine defense witnesses and put in his own rebuttal witnesses. On the other hand, once the prosecution has made its case, the defense counsel can shoot at it. What he and his witnesses say can cast doubt on the credibility of what's been said for the prosecution. He can judge the strength and weaknesses of different parts of the prosecution's case and attack that which hurts the defendant and leave untouched that which doesn't. Thus, I suppose all we can say is that the order of presentation gives each some benefits. There is some balance of advantages. There is another rough balance of advantages that it is important to note at the outset. The criminal trial, as Mr. Davies, the defense counsel, kept reminding us yesterday, is based on the notion that there is a presumption of innocence. One way of putting this might be that in order to win, the prosecutor must change the jury's mind, overcome this presumption. And he must establish guilt not just by a bare preponderance of the evidence, not just 51%. He must convince them beyond a reasonable doubt. That sounds like a lot of convincing. But is the presumption of innocence real? In fact, isn't there often a presumption of guilt? Some jurors must believe that where there's smoke, there's fire, that the state wouldn't go to all this trouble if they weren't pretty darn sure the defendant was guilty. And some will say, if you can't believe a policeman, who can you believe?
All right, at this time, I would ask all the prospective jurors to stand and be sworn in as jurors in this case.
Raise your right hands. You, each of you, do solemnly swear by the ever-living God that you will well and truly try and true deliverance make between the people of the city and county of Denver and one Lauren R. Watson, the defendant at the bar whom you will have in charge, and a true verdict give according to the law and the evidence. Please answer.
I do.
You may be seated.
Before we commence the trial, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let me point out that the procedure of the trial will be as follows. Initially, you may hear statements, opening statements by both attorneys, which go to what they intend to show in evidence. Opening statements are not evidence. After you hear opening statements, you will hear the evidence presented first by the city and then by the defendant, if in fact the defendant desires to go forward. Both attorneys will have opportunity to question all witnesses. You will hear first the direct examination and then cross-examination. After all examination evidence is presented by direct and cross-examination, you will be given instructions on the law, and after that, hear closing arguments of attorneys. You will have plenty of opportunity for deliberation when the case is completed. Mr. Morgan, did you desire to make an opening statement in this case?
No, Your Honor. I'll waive an opening statement.
Mr. Davies, did you wish to make an opening statement in this case?
Your Honor, we would reserve our opening statement for the time being.
In that case, we'll ask the city to proceed with their first witness, please.
Your Honor, I'll call Officer Cantwell as the city's first witness.
Officer, would you step forward and I'll put you under oath. Do you solemnly swear by the ever-living God that the testimony you're about to present in this cause before the court will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do, Your Honor.
Would you have a seat, please?
Would you please state your name and your occupation to the court and to the jury?
Robert C. Cantwell, Patrolman, City and County of Denver.
Officer Cantwell, how long have you been so employed as a Denver police officer?
5 years.
Officer Cantwell, directing your attention to the 6th day of November of 1968, in the middle of the morning on that day, around 10:30 a.m., did you have occasion to be in the vicinity of 34th Avenue and Franklin Street?
Yes, sir.
I'll ask you if you saw on that occasion, at or near that location, the defendant Lauren Watson.
Yes, I did.
Do you believe that you would be able to recognize and identify that same Lauren Watson whom you saw on that occasion at that location if you saw him again in the courtroom today?
Yes, I would.
If he's here, would you point him out and identify him for the record, please?
He's sitting at the defense table to your left in the black coat, black shirt, black pants.
All right. Officer Cantwell, I'm going to ask you to limit your testimony concerning the location referred to of 34th and Franklin, and ask if you had any contact with the defendant at that location on that date.
Yes, I did.
All right. Very briefly, what was the occasion of your contact with the defendant at that location?
The party was under arrest, or was advised that he was under arrest.
And Would you describe what you observed with respect to Mr. Watson, what you first observed with respect to Mr. Watson commencing at the location of 34th and Franklin?
He just got out of the car and advised him he was under arrest. There's several other parties with him in this vehicle. He used language in there, and he says, "You pigs," and he went inside the filling station there with the other parties. Me and other officers who have arrived at the scene went in, or attempted to go in the station after him. We had to...
Oh, you said station, what?
Filling station, sir.
All right, now, how many persons were initially in the car with Mr. Watson?
I believe there was 3 or 4 other ones with him.
All right, now, were there any persons other than police officers and other than other occupants of the car at the filling station at 34th and Franklin at this time?
The station was open. I'm sure there must have been a filling station attendant. However, I don't recall seeing him when the scene took place.
All right, then, as Mr. Watson got out of the car, what did he do?
I told him again, I said, "You're under arrest," and he said, "You pigs," and him and the other parties dashed for the filling station door.
All right. I might ask, officer, at this time, at the time that the defendant and the other parties dashed for the filling station door, how many times altogether had you told Mr. Watson that he was under arrest?
2 other times, sir.
All right. What did you do when they ran for the filling station door?
We pursued him.
All right. And in your effort to put Mr. Watson under arrest, were you in the immediate company of any other police officer?
Yes, sir, I was.
Who was that?
Several, Officer Frazzini.
Is that the same Officer Frazzini that's here today?
Yes, it is.
All right. Then how many other police officers were there at this time at 34th and Franklin?
There were several, and still more coming.
Then what happened?
Well, the first ones there, me and Officer Frazzini and 2 other officers went towards the door of the filling station, which was being blocked from the inside by the other occupants that was with Mr. Watson. Mr. Watson was observed from the outside either attempting to make a phone call or was already in the process of it. We hit the door, and we knocked one of the parties out of the way so we could enter the filling station.
Did you get into the filling station?
Yes, we did.
All right. What occurred next?
I went directly to Mr. Watson and advised him again that he was under arrest, to place his hands on the wall so he could be searched. At which time he refused to place his hands on the wall, continuously calling us pigs and so forth. At which time I grabbed one of his arms to restrain him so we could search him. And Officer Frazzini grabbed the other one. He swung around with the arm I had on him, which swung me loose of him. I went back, grabbed his arm, and that time several other officers came in, were in the station and assisted us in grabbing his arms, which he kept struggling his body around, making it very difficult to place handcuffs on him. We started to take him out of the filling station. Well, at this time, another party was being placed under arrest by other officers, and Mr. Watson started interfering with the other officers.
Would you describe in what manner?
We was trying to lead him towards the door, and the other party was being arrested more or less to the right of the door, and he kept struggling over there, getting in the officer's way with his legs, and we had to keep pulling him back and dragging him towards the door.
Was he saying anything with respect to the arrest of the other person at this time?
Yes, sir. He never shut up the whole time that we...
Well, I'd rather you'd tell me what he said with respect to the arrest of the third person.
Oh, you don't have to go with them pigs, you know.
Without in the slightest attempting to be facetious, officer, were there any animals of the porcine species there? Were there any pigs, four-legged animals in the station?
No, sir, there was not. I would rather depend. Is he suggesting you mean an actual animal?
Yes. Yes, I was trying to get some meaning of the word pigs in.
Well, that's fine. No objection to that.
What happened next?
Then Officer Frazzini got him into the police car, and the window was down. His windows were down, and by that time, numerous people were starting to gather around the scene, and he kept on hollering out the window, black.
I would object to this. The testimony has been that Mr. Watson was placed under arrest. Now, if the question is, one of the charges here is resisting the officer. Now, if he's been placed under arrest, then I think this is irrelevant to that particular point. And unless it can be shown that it has something to do with the other charge of interference, he's obviously in custody. He's obviously in the police cruiser. How can this possibly be relevant to resisting an arrest?
Well, Your Honor, only insofar as it would shed light on Mr. Watson's attitude or motives with respect to the opposition, only insofar as it would clarify any physical activity of his.
Well, I don't think he's charged with violating the First Amendment of the United States Constitution for speaking, Your Honor.
The objection will be sustained.
All right, fine. You may inquire, Mr. Davies.
Thank you. Officer Cantwell, I get the impression that you don't like the word pig when it's applied to you. Is that right?
How do you mean that, sir?
Well, do you take offense when somebody calls you a pig?
No, sir.
You don't. It doesn't bother you. Then there's no, that you kept mentioning in your testimony as if it perhaps had some effect. If it didn't, it's really irrelevant to this whole case, isn't it?
The word pig, yes, sir.
Calling you a pig, or any of your partners a pig. Now, during the course of this episode, did you ever have occasion to use the word nigger?
No, sir.
You never used that, did you?
No, sir.
Or how about black bastard?
No, sir.
You never used that. Any other officer in your presence use those words?
Well, I didn't hear any of them.
They could have, you just didn't hear them, is that right?
I'm sure they did.
Have you ever heard an officer use the word nigger?
Well,
Sure.
that's completely irrelevant, Your Honor, unless it pertains to this incident, this case.
Have you ever heard an officer use the word black bastard?
Again, the same objection, Your Honor.
All right, officer. Now let's, this was the day after elections, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Who won that election? Do you recall?
That is also irrelevant. Interesting, but irrelevant.
It's difficult for me to see the relevancy, Mr. Davies. I don't see any real problem if...
I think we all know who won the election anyway, so I'll withdraw the question.
All right, the question's withdrawn.
Now, when did you first see Mr. Watson on that day, Mr. Cantwell?
2800 block alley between, he was emerging out of the 2800 block alley between Welton and California Street.
Now, actually, Officer Cantwell, didn't you see him a little bit before that? Didn't you see him on the front porch of his house at 2835 Welton?
No, sir, I did not.
You didn't have your car parked out in front of that house when Mr. Watson and Mrs. Watson emerged from their house that morning?
No, I did not.
You absolutely did not.
I did not.
And you didn't stand there and wave your fist at him and say, white power now?
I did not.
You didn't do that, huh? All right. Where were you then? Take the diagram there. Draw us a diagram where you were and so forth. A diagram of the area, would you please?
Your Honor, I wonder what area we're talking about. 34th and Franklin?
I'm not sure which area you're referring to, Mr. Davies.
I want you to draw a diagram. Let me tell you what we're going to do, Mr. Cantwell. We're going to trace your path from the time you first saw him that day until you made this arrest.
Your Honor, at this point, I'm going to object. I think the material allegations of this case refer to a location of 34th and Franklin Street. I'm going to object with respect to matters that might have occurred at other locations, with the exception, I have no objections to any testimony showing that Mr. Watson may have been placed under arrest at another location, but with respect to going into the subject matter for which he was placed under arrest, I don't think that that is relevant or material to this case. I know if I attempted to introduce this evidence, I would be properly admonished.
Well, if he tried to introduce it as a prosecutor, he probably would be admonished. If he was doing it as defense lawyer, he well knows that it's absolutely correct. Now then, we have here resisting an officer. Was the officer in the performance of his duty? Was he effecting a legal arrest? And to find that out, we have to go back and find out, well, we don't know what he arrested. All he said was, I jumped out and I arrested Mr. Watson. Now, if they want to stand on that much, then I think this court can throw the case out right now. There's no showing, and as their burden is, to show that it was a legal arrest. Now, we want to go into it. We want to find out why he attempted to arrest Mr. Watson, because we say he didn't have any reason to arrest Mr. Watson, and if he didn't have any reason to arrest Mr. Watson, then Mr. Watson can't be guilty of resisting an illegal arrest.
The question of whether or not this was a lawful arrest is a question of fact, must be determined by the jury. I would ask, the issue is the arrest, and I would ask both attorneys to try to limit the questioning as much as possible to those facts and not to go into too much collateral. I understand your problems, Mr. Morgan, but certainly Mr. Davies has the right to present these facts to the jury for their determination, not for the court's determination. The court will overrule the objection. All right, Mr. Davies, let's continue with your cross-examination, please.
Thank you, Your Honor. Officer Cantwell, before you draw the diagram as I asked you to earlier, let's go back to the location of 34th and Franklin for a moment. When you pulled in, did Mr. Watson pull his car into the lot itself, the filling station lot, or was it out on the street?
Into the lot, sir.
But then before he went into the station?
From where we are.
What did you say?
Says you're under arrest.
All right. Did you tell him what he was under arrest for?
Yes, I did.
What did you tell him?
Eluding a police officer.
Eluding a police officer. Well, you were right there, weren't you?
Yes, I was.
All right, fine. Now, you were arresting him for eluding a police officer. All right. Now, tell us about his eluding a police officer. Okay?
Well, he was... I'd tried to stop him for a traffic violation, and...
All right. Now, what traffic violation?
Well, in which one?
Which one did you start to stop him for the first time? How did this all begin?
Yeah. Back to the first question.
That's right.
He was coming out of the alley there at a rate of speed, which I felt if there's a pedestrian on the crosswalk or any vehicle closer than where I was.
Well, we don't want your feelings about it. Just tell us
Well,
what
you
happened.
asked me what the
I don't want
violation
his mental state of mind.
Your Honor, he's asked a question. We're entitled to the answer.
I didn't ask him what he...
All right, gentlemen, please. I would like you to address the court and not each other, number one. If the officer would please answer the question without stating his feeling, rather just stating his observations, I think we'll avoid the objections.
He came out of the alley at a high rate of speed and...
How fast?
I don't know.
Your Honor, I'm going to interpose the objection. When the examiner asks a question, we have a right to let the witness finish answering the question before he interrupts with another question. It's elementary.
The officer may finish his answer.
And he also failed to make a complete stop at the intersection before he made a left-hand turn on the Welton.
All right. Now then, officer, would you draw us a picture of that location you've just talked about? We'll have a lot of pictures, you know.
At which locations?
Well, the alley and the intersection 28th and Welton, and I think you ought to put California Street in there and Welton Street. Why don't you draw that whole block, you know, between 28th and 29th and Welton and the alley and Welton and California. Would that encompass that area you've just talked about?
28th block alley between Welton and California, yes.
And the intersection of California and Welton and, California and 29th and Welton and 29th?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, right. That's fine. Where was Mr. Watson when you first saw him? Well, but hadn't you seen him before that?
No, sir.
You hadn't driven down that alley prior to that time and seen him in his car in the parking lot behind his house?
No, I didn't.
You hadn't. Now where was your car now? I see. And you hadn't, this is the first time you saw Mr. Watson that particular morning?
Yes, it is.
You hadn't been down the alley at all?
No,
behind
sir.
his house?
No, sir.
Okay. Now you're saying that he came through there at a high rate of speed. What would you say the speed was?
Well, just judging, I'd say he's going at least 30, 35.
30 or 35, and he didn't stop at that crosswalk. Is that your testimony?
No, he did not.
And then he turned, which way did he go?
He went right, sir.
And which way did you go? I see, and you immediately turned your light and siren on, I presume.
No, sir, I did not.
All right. What happened then?
He come around this alley, come up here, made left-hand turn here, and I got behind him here, I turned the red light on.
And you say he didn't stop at that Welton?
No, sir, he did not. Stop sign right there.
All right, and you immediately turned your light on. Now, it's not on the diagram, but tell us what transpired after that, then.
Sit down. After he made his left-hand turn on the Welton and I was in pursuit of him, I turned the overhead light on. I let it go for about a block before I hit the siren. And at which time he didn't, evidently, because of daylight or something, he might not observe the overhead light. I gave him a little leadway. When I felt that he had enough time, probably to at least be looking through his rear view mirror like he's driver's supposed to, I hit the siren, and he did pull over at 29th and Marion, 29th Avenue.
What you're saying then, officer, if I understand you, is that from the time you turned your red light on until he stopped, it was 2 blocks.
Yes.
Okay. Now what happened when he stopped?
I had asked him for his driver's license, at which time he stated, I don't have to show you my license, you've seen him before. I turned around, went to the police car, I was going to get my citation book out. I turned back around and he's in his car gone.
So you didn't place him under arrest?
Not at that time.
You didn't tell him he was under arrest?
No, sir, I did not.
Okay, then what happened?
I turned the red light and siren back on, notified the dispatcher that I was involved in a chase. At about 3 more blocks, he pulled over and he stopped, and he got out of the car, and I got out of the car, and just as I got out, I said, you're under arrest, Mr. Watson, for eluding a police officer.
Well, I thought he was under arrest for crossing a crosswalk.
No, sir.
You didn't ever arrest him for crossing that crosswalk?
No, sir, I did not.
You arrested him for eluding a police officer?
Yes, sir.
But you'd never told him he was under arrest, and he had stopped in response to your light and came out and talked to you. You didn't tell him he was under arrest. Isn't that right?
That's right.
You had a light on him for 2 blocks.
That's
He
right.
stopped his car. He came out. You said, I want to see your license. You didn't say anything about eluding a police officer. You didn't say anything about crossing a crosswalk. And you didn't say anything about a stop sign. And you didn't tell him he was under arrest. And you turned around and walked away. And he got in his car and drove off. Isn't that your testimony?
Yes, sir, it is.
And that's eluding a police officer. It's, because next you arrest him, you put your light on again, he stopped again, didn't he?
No, sir, he did
And he
not.
got out of his car and came back to you, and you said you're under arrest for eluding a police officer?
He did not stop his vehicle the second time until several
How'd he
other
get out of
blocks. He did several blocks later.
How many blocks?
Oh, I'd say at least 3 or 4.
3 or 4 blocks.
I don't have the diagram. I have a diagram, but I didn't know he was going on the traffic.
Well, you know now.
Yeah, I'll bring it tomorrow.
You may not have tomorrow. Okay, so this time you told him he was under arrest, right? For eluding a police officer.
Ron, at this point, I don't know what location we're talking about. It might be well if we could get that fixed in mind.
Will you clarify your question, Mr. Davies? Sophie?
You want me? You mean you want me to change the question, ask him the location of this arrest? That wasn't my question. That was Mr. Morgan's question. He wanted to know the location.
Yeah, I think just so the jury is not confused at which point you're talking about. We've heard about several different locations.
All right, this is the second time Mr. Watson stopped in response to your red light. Right? Now, what location was this?
I'm not exactly, but I'm pretty sure it was 30. It was the one I was pretty sure it was 31st, 33rd. It was 33rd and Marion, I believe.
All right. Now then, this time he got out of the car again?
Yeah, he just stepped out the door of it.
And you went up to him and you said...
No, I didn't get a chance to get up to him.
You were some distance away, and you said...
Well, I parked the police vehicle behind his car.
How close to his car?
Oh, from here to you.
Okay. And you were about from me to you, and you said to him, you're under arrest for eluding a police officer.
He got out, and I got out, and I said, you're under arrest for eluding a police officer.
What did he say?
He didn't say nothing. He just jumped back in his car and took off again.
All right, then. So he got back in his car, and then this time you followed him all the way to 34th and Franklin, right?
Yes, sir, that's
Now,
right.
how many blocks would that be?
About 5 blocks.
At which point, he got out of his car, and you again said you're under arrest?
Yes, I did.
And did you say for eluding a police officer?
Yes, I did.
All right. And he went into the filling station and started making a phone call.
Yes, he did.
You know who he was calling?
Not probably you, huh?
Yeah, that's right. By the way, does the defendant have a right to talk to his lawyer when he's in that situation? Do you know, from your own knowledge?
Sure, I advised him.
But you jerked him away from the phone when he was trying to call me.
I think he was
You
already...
said in other words, it's okay to advise him that he can talk to his lawyer, but it's not all right for him to talk to his lawyer. Is that what you're saying?
He was hanging the phone up when we got in there.
Now, Officer Cantwell, I want to give you every opportunity to refresh your recollection in this manner. It's my understanding that your testimony is that you did not see, in the morning in question, you did not see Mr. and Mrs. Watson on the front porch of their house and didn't say something to them. Is that your testimony?
Yes, sir, it is.
Absolutely not.
Yes, sir.
And you did not then drive down the alley behind Mr. Watson's house and block his exit from his parking lot.
No, I did not, sir.
And you never saw him down there. The first time you saw him, he was here.
That's right, sir.
All right. And would you also say, Mr. Cantwell, that you did not, that when Mr. Watson exited from this alley, you were not parked this way, going this way?
I was not, sir. I was just making a left-hand turn onto California.
And that when he pulled out of here, you didn't go around the block and come back down and pursue him?
No, sir, I did not.
So that if somebody said they saw Mr. Watson go by their filling station over here somewhere, and you come after about 5 blocks, about a five-block difference between you, without your siren and red light on, you would suggest that he was mistaken, I presume.
He would if he said it was me.
And if anybody said that they saw you in front of Mr. Watson's house that morning yelling, "White power now," after the election, they would be mistaken too.
That's right.
And if 5 people saw you in the alley behind the Watson's house prior to his coming down the alley on 2 occasions, they would be mistaken too, wouldn't they?
Definitely.
And if somebody saw you driving down here after Mr. Watson pulled out of the alley and go around the block, they'd be mistaken too, wouldn't they?
Yes, sir, they would.
It's a big conspiracy.
That's right.
All right. Now then. Now you got to the after this 30-mile-an-hour chase. You got to the filling station. He got out of his car and went into the filling station to use the phone. Correct?
If that's he went into the filling station, yes, sir.
And started to use the phone.
Yes, sir.
All right. Now before you got to him, he hung up the phone.
I don't think he was going up with it. I don't know what he was.
And you
it
grabbed
happened so fast. I don't know what.
And you and Frazzini grabbed him, or what?
At which time, sir?
Right then.
No, I grabbed him first by myself.
All right. And then what happened?
Then I grabbed him after he refused to place his arms on the wall for a search, and then I went.
Well, wait a minute, because we missed something. I asked you what happened. You said you grabbed him. You didn't grab him, though you did something.
You said I grabbed him.
You said you grabbed him, but tell me what happened. What happened? You say you asked him to put his hands on the wall?
Yes, I did, so he could be searched. I advised him at the same time this was going in.
You advised him what?
That he was under arrest.
And what else did you tell
Of his verbal rights, pertinent rights.
What? Like?
He had the right to make side anything say used against you in court. You had the right to attorney either appointed or if you can't afford one, to be appointed to you for questioning, you understand, and It's just a routine procedure that goes along with any other arrest besides drunk arrest.
I see. So as I understand it, you came barging in the store. Watson was by the phone. He had the phone in his thing. You ran up. You asked him to put his hands on the wall to be searched and advised him of these things.
We advised him. We didn't run up to him, literally like you say.
No,
there.
well, you walked quickly.
Quickly.
Uh-huh. And you advised him. What did he do while you were advising him?
Well, as stated previously, he never restrained himself from using vulgar language and numerous times referring to us as...
Yeah, you went through all that.
Yes.
But you said
Well,
you said you didn't mind
I
it.
presume he wanted to hear it again, or he wouldn't have asked him, so let's hear it again.
The objection is proper. Let the officer finish answering the question.
All right. He seems rather enamored by those words anyway, so go ahead. If you...
Your Honor, I'm going to object to the off-the-cuff remarks of counsel. Now, I think that the matter is supposedly serious for everybody concerned, and I object to the flippant, facetious manner in which counsel is examining the witness. There's a proper way to do it.
Let me just state that
Your
the
Honor.
objection is sustained as to a comment which is not a question. The jury will please strike the comment which is not a question. Now, Officer Cantwell, do you remember the question that you were answering?
Would you repeat the question, please?
I asked you what Mr. Watson did while you were advising him of his rights.
But at that time, I'd grabbed hold of his arms at that time because he refused to place him on the wall. And that's the time I grabbed him by his arm. And when I couldn't bring it down and control him, Officer Frazzini also was at that point, grabbed him. And at that time, he was swinging his body around and swung me loose of him. At the time, I went back and grabbed his arm again. And at that time, two other officers assisted at us getting his arms behind his back so we could put the handcuffs on him.
Did he hit either one of you?
No, sir, he did not strike us.
All right, then what did you do?
Me and Frazzini attempted to take him out the station.
You say you attempted what?
Well, we had to struggle with him pretty numerous more times to get him through the outside. He kept wanting to go over to the other party. He was being
He was
arrested.
reluctant to go, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
Officer Cantwell, isn't it true that many police officers have the opinion in City County of Denver that there is a bullet waiting for Mr. Watson from a police gun?
I never heard
Your Honor,
that
I'm
one.
going to have to object to this. This witness could hardly answer. If he wants to ask individual officers, he can call them, but this witness is not competent to state what's in the minds of other persons not in court.
First of all, Your Honor, the question wasn't asked of mental state, it's whether it was expressed. It's not asked to elicit for the truth of the matter, but whether or not it's been said.
The objection is overruled and the question may be asked for whatever it's worth.
Have you ever heard anybody say that?
I never heard it that way.
How have you heard it?
I've heard he had a bullet waiting for one of us.
Oh, really? I see. But he was handcuffed at this time, right?
Yes, he was.
Well, wouldn't you say it's accurate to say, Mr. Cantwell, that there's a general feeling of distrust between the police officers in this community and Mr. Watson on both sides?
I don't understand the question, sir.
Do you think that he trusts the police in this town?
Well, now, again, Your Honor, the defendant's the best one to answer that question.
The objection is sustained.
Do you think Mr. Watson is a bad person?
I don't even know him.
You never met him before that day?
No, sir, I've seen his picture, but I've never met him. I've still never met him personally.
But you have never talked to him or anything like
No,
that?
sir, I never.
So you don't think he's a bad person?
No, sir.
And you don't know whether he thinks you're a bad person?
I got his general opinion that day.
Yeah, like maybe he was afraid of you. Huh?
I don't think it's that way.
Now, Mr. Campbell, didn't you in fact tell a reporter from the Rocky Mountain News that you had told Mr. Watson he was under arrest on the first occasion when he didn't show you his driver's license?
I never did talk to a reporter from the Rocky Mountain News.
Okay. Never at all?
No, sir, I did not.
And if he thought you had, he was probably mistaken.
If the article he probably wrote up was he's taking it directly off the reports like they do. We have no say-so what they did.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that. Did you make a report relating to this instance?
Yes, I did.
All right. Did you reduce it to writing?
Yes, I did.
Do you know where that report is now?
It's probably in the internal affairs.
All right. Your Honor, under Rule 16, whatever the rule is, we would ask that this be produced for our inspection.
Oh, the police have a tremendous problem. I really have great sympathy for the policeman because he takes a lot of things. I hear again and again cases where people are extremely nasty to police officers. People like to be nasty to police officers. I think this is sometimes a game almost. You talk back to police officers, and then the person comes into court and they're not nasty, they're just sweet and nice, and they get up on the witness stand and they're sincere and sorry, and the judge considers this, and the policeman thinks to himself, you know, what a change. And I know this happens. People can be very nasty on the street to police officers. They have to take a lot of guff, but I always tell police officers that that's part of their job. They have to have a thick skin.
Well, they say pigs can't hurt, the word, you can call policemen anything you want to because they're supposed to have a patience a joke. You can't hurt them. You can't hurt their feelings. Well, here I am. I've got a wife. I've got 2 children. Do I look different than you or anyone else? You got a mustache. I don't. But I'm human, I put the uniform on because that's my job. Should I be treated any different than anyone else? I like respect too, not because I'm a policeman, because I'm a human. People calls me names, sure. I don't take physical action like if you're downtown somewhere and somebody comes up to you and calls you a dirty, rotten pig.
Oh, I think as far as just the words are concerned, they shouldn't be too disturbed. That just doesn't bother me that much. But when it's said to them enough and said to them in a way so as to provoke these officers, a lot of these expressions again and again and in different ways just to provoke, you can understand, I think, why they lose their cool and get upset. They're human. They're individuals. They are subject to the same problems that all of us have. We don't like to be called names.
Now then, you indicate in your report that at the 2900 block of Marion, the party was stopped by Officer Cantwell, and that the defendant, you say subject, Watson, got out of his vehicle and approached the police car, at which time you had gotten out of the police car and you were approaching him. Is that accurate, sir?
Yes, that part is, yes, sir.
As I recall your earlier testimony, you had your siren and red light on, but you don't mention it here.
Well, you don't put all that, how else are you going to stop him? Just going to honk your horn at him?
Well, I don't know, officer.
Well, that's understood, sir.
Is that understood?
Yes, sir.
So you wouldn't necessarily mention that in the report. Is that what you're saying? It's
that's right, sir. Yes,
sort
sir.
of assumed by all of
yes, sir.
Everybody. All right. Then you say that you asked Watson for his driver's license, and he told you that he did not have to show it to you, that you had seen it before. Had you seen it before?
No, sir, I have not.
All right. Then you say Watson was advised by Officer Cantwell that he was under arrest for failure to show his driver's license. Your testimony this morning was that you did not advise him he was under arrest at that time. Which is it?
Well, as the report shows, that is, I didn't read this report prior to court, and evidently I did put him under arrest at that time.
So your earlier testimony this morning was inaccurate.
That's correct, sir.
You say then it goes on, it says, Officer Cantwell then, I guess you're referring to yourself, aren't you? Then attempted to stop him numerous times by using the red light and siren. Now it suddenly has become a significant. Before you didn't mention it because it was insignificant. Now you mention it because it is significant. You mentioned that you had your red light and siren on now. Isn't it really true, Officer Cantwell, that the reason you mention it at this point is that you didn't have it on the first time, that you turned it on after the first stop, that he stopped voluntarily after seeing you behind him? Isn't that true?
No, sir, that's not true.
But you mention it the second time and not mention it the first time in your report.
That's correct.
The first time in the same report you didn't mention it because it was insignificant. The second time you mention it because it is significant, but it's the same fact. Your light and siren, isn't that correct?
Two different reasons, sir.
Your Honor, at this time, I would like to approach the bench with counsel. I have a small matter to take up with the court, very briefly.
Mr. Davies?
This may seem of some insignificance, Your Honor, but I don't think that we suspended the usual rules of propriety with respect to examination of witnesses, and I object to counsel examining a witness from his seat at counsel table.
I thought maybe Mr. Davies was tired.
Let me see. I don't know of any local rule that requires it.
It's just
Any
custom.
rule of propriety that requires that. He's sitting down. Let him stand up, and I'll stand up. We'll both stand up.
All right. Mr.
I'm asking
No,
for-
all right, no. Mr. Davies, why don't you come back here a second? I see you.
I don't have any real strong feelings, but I think it is preferable to have an attorney stand. I don't know what the other judges rule on this. Have this as in my
custom.
in my court.
He doesn't object when
I
I sit
thought
back on the table. You object to that, too?
well, we can be somewhat relaxed. I think it's a question of custom, Leonard. Why don't you stand or sit on the edge of the table? Okay.
All right. Let's continue with the cross-examination.
Where were we, officer?
The red light and siren.
The red light and siren. Okay. And then you indicate that at 32nd of Marion, the defendant or subject, Watson, pulled over, stopped again, and got out of his car. And that you again advised this party that he was under arrest again for eluding a police officer. Of course, the first time you'd advised him he was under arrest for not showing his driver's license, right?
That's correct, sir.
Now, you're sure that that first time you did, in fact, tell me he was under arrest?
Yes, sir.
Rather than what you said under oath this morning that you hadn't said he was under arrest?
Yes, sir, that's true.
Okay. Then he got back in his car. All right. Now then, you indicate in your report, officer, that he pulled into the filling station and he got out of his car. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And this morning your testimony was that he got out of the car and you yelled at him that he was under arrest and he ran in and started to use the phone. Does that accurately state what you said this morning?
Yes, it is.
Now, it seems that in the report you indicate that you... Oh, and I think this morning you also indicated that you and Officer Frazzini were there together by this time, that Officer Frazzini had come along. Is that right?
Yes, that's true, sir.
Now, in the report you indicate that Officer A.D. Pinto was the first on the scene and, along with you, advised Watson to place his hands on the vehicle so that he could be searched prior to being placed in a police car. Is that right in the report? Is that an accurate reading of the report?
Yes, it is, sir.
But that doesn't go along with what you said this morning under oath. You said he jumped out of the car and ran into the filling station. Now, which is it?
Which is what?
Well, what did you do? The report says that you stopped, that you went up to him, you told him to put his hands on the vehicle so he could be searched. That's what you say in your report. This morning you made no mention of that. You said he jumped out of his car and ran in and started using the telephone.
If your report reads like my report reads, it does not say in here that I approached him at any time.
All right. Then you say at this time Watson refused to place his hands on the vehicle and hurriedly went into the filling station. So not only did you tell him he's under arrest and he should put his hands on the vehicle, but he even responded and said he wasn't going to, right? So you did have some conversation.
No, sir.
He didn't say that?
No, sir.
You said he refused.
Well, he didn't put him up there.
Oh, what you meant to say was he didn't put his hands up on the vehicle, not that he refused.
That's right.
All right. Now then you go on to say that on our arrival into the station, Watson was using the telephone with the other 3 male and 1 female parties standing around him. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Then you said that he was advised he was under arrest. Again advised that he was under arrest. and you began to search his person, at which time Watson started struggling to keep officers from searching him. Is that accurate?
Yes, correct, sir.
In other words, on the day of the offense, you indicated that his struggle with you is over the question of whether you're going to search him, not whether you're going to arrest him.
Both.
You don't mention the other one in your report, do you?
Well, that's understood, sir.
Oh, is it?
By the Internal Affairs, yes, sir.
I see. Now, officer, in this day and age, the advisement of people as to their rights has become rather important for the police, hasn't it? I mean, you mentioned that you advised this man while you were coming in to get him off the phone. When you got up to him, you advised him of his rights. Isn't that correct?
After I advised him that he was under arrest again, yes, sir.
Yeah, but you did advise him of his rights.
Verbally, yes, sir.
But you don't mention in the report anything about advising Mr. Watson until after you got him down to the police station.
That's right.
Didn't you think that was important?
No, sir, not for them.
As far as this report's
That's
concerned,
right.
you didn't think that was
No,
very
sir,
important?
That's right.
Isn't it really the fact that you just didn't advise him at that time, Officer Cantwell? I mean, think of it, officer. Try and refresh your memory.
I don't have to. I know I did.
Well, let's talk about it a little bit. Maybe, you'll have some flash of recollection that will be important to you. You've gone through a slow-speed chase. There are at least 8 officers there, 7 officers there. A lot of people are falling on the floor. People are getting tugged. You're handcuffing people. There's somewhat of a concern, isn't there, for the possibility of a situation developing that might be unhealthy. Isn't that true? And you're standing there advising this man while you're telling him to be searched and stuff. Is that really right, officer?
Yes.
I'm going to have to object to this.
You really
Your Honor.
expect us to believe
I have
that,
an
officer?
objection
Do you
before
really?
the
I don't
court,
care what you
if I
believe.
may.
Let me hear the objection.
Your
Any
Honor,
other questions?
this statement that may have been suffixed with a question mark is so long, involves so many facts that it could not be answered. It has the vice of being obviously a multiple question.
Let me say
I
this,
think
Your
he
Honor.
has to break it down into questions that can be answered point by point and fact by fact instead of such a long dissertation. Isn't this so, officer?
It may come as some surprise to Mr. Morgan, but I am not directing my questions at him. The officer answered the question. He's the best judge of whether he can answer and comprehend the question. Maybe his level of comprehension is higher than Mr. Morgan's. We don't know, but I think he's the one to make that decision, Your Honor.
That may be true, Your Honor, but I seriously doubt if either Mr. Davies or the witness's level of comprehension concerning the rules of evidence is on the same level, and I think it's for me to make the objections when a question is so patently improper as this.
In the future, the court will ask the questions to be one question at a time.
All right. Let me ask this, officer. It's my understanding that you charged Mr. Watson with eluding a police officer. Is that right?
Yes, I did.
Now, when you charge someone with eluding a police officer, when you have a high-speed chase and finally run them down, which this wasn't a high-speed chase, you run them down, or catch up with them, I shouldn't say run them down. Do you charge him with eluding a police officer and resisting arrest?
Not if you don't resist.
Well, he's driving, you're trying to arrest him and he's driving away at 120 miles an hour. Isn't that kind of resisting arrest?
I never look at it that way, but I never have charged one.
If you looked at it that way, you might think it might be resisting arrest. But it's because eluding a police officer is really the same as resisting arrest, only you're in a car, isn't that right?
Oh, Your Honor, I'm going to have to object to this. In the first place, the court will be giving instructions on what resistance is. Counsel well knows what it is. He knows
Your
the
Honor, I
elements are
object to
different.
this continual statement by Mr. Morgan that counsel well knows. I well know a lot of
Very
things.
well,
I well know
counsel
his
should
attempts.
know then.
The question, as I understand, goes to distinguishing between a charge of eluding which is not before this court or jury and should not be considered by them.
I would submit.
As to, all right, except on the related question of whether this was a valid arrest. As distinguishing certain actions on one alleged charge with certain actions on another alleged charge. For this purpose, without asking the officer a legal question, the question may be asked and answered over objection. If I understand your question, Mr. Davies.
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you.
Can you answer, or do you want the question repeated, officer?
I'll have to be repeated, Your Honor. I'll withdraw the question, Your Honor.
Question is withdrawn. Let's have another question then, Mr. Davies.
Now then, Officer Cantwell, let's see if we can get some things together here. First of all, you say on the summons and complaint, in effect, what you're saying is that Mr. Watson resisted a search. You had already placed him under arrest, and there's no mention of his resisting that arrest, only resisting the search. Is that right?
Again,
Isn't that what it says on the summons and complaint?
I'm going to have to object to the form of the question, Your Honor, as, again, I have to say, as counsel well knows or should know, the ordinance charge is resisting a police officer in the discharge or apparent discharge of his duty. It's not what counsel framed in the question.
All right, then, Your Honor, I admit we have to go into the question of the search, then, if that's what Mr. Morgan's agreeing to the fact that the resistance was to a search, then I suppose we have to go into the question of the search.
Well, the charge is resisting a police officer, Your Honor.
The ordinance, which the jury will be instructed on later, of course, reads, "It shall be unlawful for any person to resist any police officer," etc.
Well, I think if you're going to read the ordinance to the people, you ought to read the whole thing, Your Honor. If I may suggest, I think a portion of it is somewhat misleading.
Be happy to. Shall be unlawful for any person to resist any police officer, any member of the police department, or any person duly empowered with police authority while in the discharge or apparent discharge of his duty, or in any way to interfere with or hinder him in the discharge or apparent discharge of his duty. Now, what was the question?
The question was, Your Honor, I don't know whether you've ruled on the objection.
No, I'd like to hear the question again to refresh myself, please.
The question is, isn't it true, officer, that from the notes you made on the summons and complaint, what you're saying is that you placed him under arrest and a struggle ensued after you started to frisk him, but that he was already under arrest at that point? You say when officers started to frisk him, he started struggling. He was already under arrest then, isn't that true?
Yes, sir, it's true.
So then, in fact, officer, isn't it true that the resistance charge stems from his resisting your frisking him?
No, sir.
Then is it true, officer, that the resistance charge stems from his not stopping for the police car?
No, sir.
All right. Now then, Officer Cantwell, this morning you said that you got out of your car and Frazzini was the first one there. This afternoon you've indicated that it was a Mr. Officer DePinto. Is that correct?
To my recollection, I stated there were numerous police officers there. You asked me how many. I couldn't give you a definite number. You asked who went inside, and if I remember right, I stated to you me and Officer Frazzini and other officers. And I also stated to you that it took two other officers besides myself and Frazzini to subdue Mr. Watson.
All right. Now, when did you say that?
If you recall, this morning I testified that I grabbed one arm and Officer Frazzini grabbed the other arm, at which time Mr. Watson threw me off of his arm, at which time when I grabbed his arm again, two other officers came to our assistance and helped us in getting his hands behind his back to put the cuffs on him.
What, did they each grab a leg, or just what did they do?
Just each helped us on the arms, yes, sir.
So you had two officers on each arm.
I don't know how actually who had what arm or to that.
In other words, it was, all right. Now then, as I understand your testimony this afternoon then, officer, this Johnson person was under arrest a considerable period of time, or at least some period of time, prior to your removing Mr. Watson from the filling station. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And that on your way out of the filling station, in very close proximity, at least the way you described it here, about 3 or 4 feet, Johnson and some other officers were wrestling on the floor.
They weren't laying on the floor.
Wrestling on the floor.
They were on their knees, more so. They weren't laying across the floor, if that's what you mean.
All right. And it was somewhat of a struggle, isn't that correct? Now you're saying, also in addition to that, you're saying that Mr. Watson, who had his hands cuffed behind his back, and you and Frazini on each side, somehow, are you suggesting that he interfered with what they were doing on the floor? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, I am. Yes, sir.
How did he interfere with it?
He went into him. He walked into him. One of the officers, he walked into him, causing...
Which officer did Mr. Watson interfere with?
I don't know his name.
You don't recall that?
Don't recall it.
How did he interfere with him? What happened? Physically, what happened? You say lunged in. What happened to the officer when Mr. Watson, who had Frazini between him and this officer, what happened?
Frazini wasn't between him and the officer.
Well, Frazini was on this arm, wasn't he?
I stated I was on that arm.
Well, you're on that arm. Well, you're between him and the officer then. Is that it?
That's right.
Well, didn't he push you into the officer?
He went sideways, sir. Just like you're standing now.
Yeah. He went sideways, this way. Did he turn around, you mean?
Not that. Right there. That's the way we was taking him out.
But the door's over here.
That's right. Straight in front of him.
Oh, well, he was standing like this.
Yeah. I don't... we'd go down and take pictures, but I don't recall exactly how that station is...
Well, I think it's important that you recall, officer.
Well, I don't recall.
You just don't remember. You
That's
remember that somehow, somewhere in that melee, an officer got bumped by Mr. Watson, and you charged him with interference for that, for a man that was already arrested. Is that what you're saying?
That's right.
Did you make the arrest of Johnson?
No, sir, I did not.
You don't know what transpired between him and the officer to necessitate Johnson's arrest?
Yes, I do.
By your own, from what you saw and observed?
Mr. Johnson was one of the parties, the main party, matter of fact, who was holding the door to keep us from entering the filling station. And I'm sure that is, I'd have to see the arrest slip and the details of what the other officers wrote on there, but I'm sure that is one of the details that led to his arrest for interference or whatever he was charged with.
Well, right. You're saying then, of your own knowledge, you know that Johnson was arrested for holding that door.
I said I believe that is one of the charges.
You don't know for sure.
I haven't seen the arrest slip.
But in your report, you make no mention of anybody holding a door.
No, sir, I do not. This report here, no, sir, I do not.
Is it because nobody was holding the door?
No, sir.
Or because it wasn't important in your opinion?
It was not important to this...
But you mentioned that these people, officer, were standing around Mr. Watson.
Yes, sir.
Now, if you were going to describe...
Just like you're standing now.
Yeah. He went sideways, this way. Did he turn around, you mean?
Not that. Right there. That's the way we was taking him out.
But the door's over here.
That's right. Straight in front of him.
Oh, well, he was standing like this.
Yeah. I don't... we'd go down and take pictures, but I don't recall exactly how that station is...
Well, I think it's important that you recall, officer.
Well, I don't recall.
You just don't remember. You
That's
remember that somehow, somewhere in that melee, an officer got bumped by Mr. Watson, and you charged him with interference for that, for a man that was already arrested. Is that what you're saying?
That's right.
Did you make the arrest of Johnson?
No, sir, I did not.
You don't know what transpired between him and the officer to necessitate Johnson's arrest?
Yes, I do.
By your own, from what you saw and observed?
Mr. Johnson was one of the parties, the main party, matter of fact, who was holding the door to keep us from entering the filling station. And I'm sure that is... I'd have to see the arrest slip and the details of what the other officers wrote on there, but I'm sure that is one of the details that led to his arrest for interference or whatever he was charged with.
Well, right. You're saying then, of your own knowledge, you know that Johnson was arrested for holding that door.
I said I believe that is one of the charges.
You don't know for sure.
I haven't seen the arrest slip.
But in your report, you make no mention of anybody holding a door.
No, sir, I do not. This report here, no, sir, I do not.
Is it because nobody was holding the door?
No, sir.
Or because it wasn't important in your opinion?
It was not important to this.
But you mentioned that these people, officer, were standing around Mr. Watson.
Yes,
Now,
sir.
if you were going to describe where they were, and they were in fact holding the door, and you were going to take the trouble to describe where they were, why didn't you say they were holding the door?
The reason that I even put that in to show them that they were also inside the service station along with Mr. Watson.
But in your testimony this morning, you indicated that you had to, in fact, break in the door. Isn't that important?
Yes, it is.
But you didn't mention it in your report. Isn't that right?
It's not important to this, no, sir.
Important to this trial, you mean?
To this report.
But this was a rather lengthy report that you filled out, isn't it? 2 pages?
There are a lot of reasons why things are in this report.
The question is, isn't this a rather lengthy report?
Well, I've made a lot more.
I want him to answer the question, not to...
I would like counsel to permit him to answer the previous question before he fires another one at him. He was answering one question when counsel interrupted with another.
He was answering a question I never asked, Your Honor, and I don't want him volunteering.
Number one, when a question is asked, please give the witness opportunity to fully answer. Number two, I would ask Officer Cantwell to answer the last question. We'll go from there. Is it or isn't it a lengthy report, Officer Cantwell?
No, ma'am, it's not.
We have no further questions of this witness, Your Honor.
Redirect, Mr. Morgan.
Officer Cantwell, just get a few things in focus and in perspective here. What is the speed limit in alleys in Denver?
20 miles an hour.
All right. And what speed was it you said Mr. Watson came out of this alley in the beginning?
I estimated, I believe, 30.
By the way, Officer Cantwell, does a resistance report purport to contain a complete narration of all the events that occurred with respect to an arrest?
No, sir, they do not. It does not.
Is it limited to just certain subject matter?
Yes, sir.
What is the subject matter that this report is limited to?
They're more, the Internal Affairs Bureau is more concerned to see if any injuries were sustained by the party, and if so, how they were sustained.
In other words, there might be several facts occur that would be part of the whole situation that would not relate directly to the resistance. Is that the idea of the resistance report?
Yes, she'd be writing all day.
All right. Now, I have no further questions. However, I would like to have this document, Your Honor, marked as City's Exhibit A.
Would you mark that as City's Exhibit A? That's fine. Exhibit is marked.
Your Honor, I would hand the exhibit to Mr. Davies in ordinary practice. I have given him a photocopy of it. I'll offer Exhibit A into evidence at this time.
Do you have any objection, Mr. Davies?
Oh, yes. Absolutely. I don't even know what this is. No foundation's been laid for the admission of that particular exhibit.
You want to lay some foundation, Mr. Morgan. I think there has been foundation generally to what a report of resistance incident is. Let's follow the rules strictly, and if you'll identify this particular...
All right, Officer Cantwell, have you had a chance to examine the document that's been marked as City's Exhibit A?
Could you hand Exhibit A to Officer Cantwell, please?
Yes, I have.
What is Exhibit A?
It's a report of resistance. It's a photocopy of the resistance.
Isn't it true, officer, that another object of this report is that if a person taken into custody files a complaint against you with the Internal Affairs Bureau, then this is filed by you to somehow at least protect yourself in the event of a complaint being filed against you. Isn't that one of the reasons for it? to get your side of the story down on paper with the Internal Affairs Bureau?
I can't answer that question yes, and honestly, no, that is the purpose of it, because I've never checked into their functions and what, so I would have got the original from the captain if he was available today, so I went to the Internal Affairs. I would have got a copy from the captain, but I went to Internal Affairs to get the original.
Nothing further, this witness.
I have no further redirect of the witness, Your Honor.
All right. Did you wish to recross-examine?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Davies. Thank you, Officer Cantwell. You may have a seat.
I'll call Officer Frazzini, Your Honor.
Would you please ask Officer Frazzini to come in and be sworn?
Would you state your name and your occupation to the court, please?
Gerald Frazzini, policeman, Denver Police Department.
How long have you been so employed as a Denver police officer, Officer Frazzini?
4 years.
Directing your attention to the 6th day of November 1968 around 10:30 a.m. on that date, did you have occasion to be at or near the location of 34th Avenue and Franklin Street?
I did.
Was that location in the city and county of Denver, Colorado?
It was.
Did you see the defendant Lauren Watson at or near that location on that date?
I did.
Would you be able to recognize and identify the same Lauren Watson if you saw him in court today?
Yes, I would.
If he's here, would you point him out and clearly identify him?
It's a man seated to your left with a black leather jacket on.
All right. Tell the court and the jury where Mr. Watson, the defendant, was when you first observed him, and then describe what you observed.
When I first observed him, he was in a car, a white car with a black top, and he was pulling into a service station at 34th and Franklin. Mr. Watson got out of the car and ran into the filling station along with several other Negro parties that were also in the same car.
All right. Where had you first joined Officer Cantwell, at least your police car in close proximity to his? What location?
Northbound on Marion Street, approximately around 28th, somewhere in that vicinity.
All right. Now, when you got to 34th and Franklin, you say that the defendant pulled in the service station and jumped out of his car and ran into the station. Is that right?
That's correct.
And what occurred next?
Myself and Officer Cantwell Officer Cantwell told the party as he got out of his car that he was under arrest for eluding a police officer. Mr. Watson continued to run into the filling station, and several other parties with him all ran into the filling station, service station, and they shut the door behind them and they blocked the door so that we could not enter. Myself and Officer Cantwell and several other officers then had to push the door open, which was blocked by 2 or 3 Negro males.
Do you chance to recall at this time approximately how many police officers were at 34th and Franklin at the time that you arrived?
Officer DePino and myself arrived there approximately at the same time, and there were some other officers there that arrived almost all of us arrived about the same time. Myself and Officer DePino were there, and then the rest of them come too within a short few minutes.
All right. Then what happened after the defendant and the other parties locked the door?
They didn't lock the door. They were barring the door with their bodies, and we had to push the door open, and we walked inside and inside the service station, and Mr. Watson was on the telephone. He just hung up the telephone, and he turned, and Officer Cantwell told him he was under arrest for eluding a police officer, and says, we wanted to search him to see if he had any weapons before we placed him on our police car to take him downtown. And I grabbed one arm, and Officer Cantwell grabbed the other arm. At this time, Mr. Watson getting a wrestle with us and threw Officer Cantwell
against the wall of the service station. And at this time, several other of the officers grabbed Mr. Watts along with myself, and we forcibly put his hands behind his back and handcuffed him after quite a struggle in the small room there was in the service station.
All right, what occurred next, Officer Frazzini?
Myself and Officer Cantwell was, we had already handcuffed Mr. Watson. We were attempting to take him outside, and these several Negro parties, I don't remember if there were 2 or 3 Negro males inside the service station, and they were trying to stop us from taking him outside, grabbing, one of them grabbed my arm, and I don't remember if it was Officer DiPino or one of the other officers grabbed this party, and eventually we got him outside after somewhat more of a struggle, and Mr. Watson was continually trying to pull away from us and continually resisting us, fighting us all the way, even after we had handcuffed him and more or less subdued him.
Did Mr. Watson, the defendant, say anything while all this was going on that you remember?
Yes, he stated when we first grabbed him when we was in the station, when I first grabbed his arm, he called me a pig, and he told me that I wasn't going to take him to jail. And several times after that, he called me the same name, told me that I couldn't take him, or we couldn't take him if he didn't want us to. And in the wrestle, he stated that pig several times.
What else happened?
We took him outside, and he was hollering louder, black power and pigs and so on like that. And we finally got him in the back of the police car, and myself and Officer Cantwell took him down to headquarters.
I have no further questions. You may inquire, Mr.
Thank you, Your Honor. Officer Frazzini, did I understand you to say that you responded to this call and you first saw the defendant at about 28th and Marion Street?
Somewhere in that vicinity, yes, sir, right in there somewhere. May have been 30th or 29th or 28th, right in that general vicinity. Several blocks one way or the other.
I see. Now, would you describe what was going on when you first saw him?
Officer Cantwell's car was behind the car which was being driven by Mr. Watson, and
where were you in relationship to those two cars, may I ask?
I was behind Officer Cantwell's car.
About how far?
Oh, maybe a half a block, 3/4 of a block, something like that. And they were proceeding north on Marion Street, and Officer Cantwell's car had his red light and siren going.
Well, did you see him stop?
No, I never did. Who? See who stopped?
Mr. Watson.
No, sir, I never did see him stop.
He never stopped from when you intercepted him at about 29th and Marion. You never saw Mr. Watson stop his car.
No, I didn't.
Until 34th and Franklin.
That's right.
He just kept right on going.
Right.
Right?
Right.
He pulled in and you pulled in, and there wasn't much difference in time between your arrival there, right?
No, Officer Cantwell pulled in and DiPino come in, and then it was almost the same time, right?
Right, and but Cantwell got out of his car considerably before you did.
No, I'd say maybe a few seconds, not very much more than that.
So you had Cantwell in your vision and
Yes,
could
sir.
see him?
Yes, sir.
And I think your testimony was you heard Cantwell yell to Watson, "You're under arrest for looting a police officer."
That's right.
Did did Watson respond?
No, he didn't even look. He just went right into the filling station door.
What else did Cantwell say?
When he got out of his car, or?
After he said you're under arrest for looting a police officer. Anything?
Not that I recall, no.
All right. Let me see if I have this all right now, officer, because I don't in any way want to trap you in anything. You and Cantwell forced your way into, there were these people were blocking the door. You forced your way in, right?
With several other officers, myself and Officer Cantwell, too.
Right. Informed Watson he was under arrest.
Right.
He apparently said something to you that indicated to you that he wasn't going to go voluntarily. Is that correct?
I don't recall any statements that
You
Mr.
just went ahead and
Watson
grabbed him.
Well, I
Each of
grabbed
you-
one arm and he grabbed the
All right,
other.
and nothing more was said to him by Officer Cantwell at that time other than the fact you're under arrest. He might have said, repeated, you're under arrest. Is that right?
Yeah, that's.
Okay.
I recall.
And he kind of threw Officer Cantwell off.
He had his back to well, actually, to Officer Cantwell and myself, and he was facing the phone. When he turned around, he turned around with the force of his body there, and his arm come around, and as his arm come around, Officer Cantwell was more or less had a hold of it, and that's when he threw him.
Oh. But, I mean, it was a natural... Watson had to turn around to go out the door, right? I mean, he had his face to the telephone when you first grabbed
He
him.
turned around. When Watson turned around, it was in a threatening manner towards myself and Officer Cantwell, with his arms swinging towards us.
Okay. And then you finally got him handcuffed. And Watson was cussing, and you indicated,
Right,
And nobody
Yeah, he
else,
was-
just Watson, nobody else. Or probably some of the other Negroes, but none of the white officers.
I don't recall any of the other Negroes saying anything.
Or just Watson was cussing.
That's all I recall.
Okay. All right, so then you subdued him. Was anything else said to him during that period of time? By any officers?
Officer Cantwell might have advised him of his rights. I don't remember if he did or
You
not.
can't recall. Whether
No.
what it would have been after he was handcuffed.
Somewhere right in that time, yes.
And you started out the door, and as you were walking out the door, this other guy lunged at you, grabbed hold of you to try and stop you from taking Watson out, and other officers grabbed him, and they had a scuffle, and you went on out the door with Watson. Is that right?
Pretty close. The other party was standing in front of the door, and he wasn't going to let us go out to the other officers.
And that's the substance of what happened.
Right, pretty close, yes.
No further questions. This witness.
I don't have any redirect, Your Honor.
Thank you, Officer Frazzini. You may have a seat.
Your Honor, I think I'll reserve resting. I note the hour until we've taken up the matter that we're going to take up tomorrow morning. I think.
Of Exhibit A?
Yes.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as far as your work is concerned, it is over for the day at least. I will excuse you then until 10:30 tomorrow morning. You may leave the courtroom at this time. You're welcome to get your coats. Court will be in recess then until tomorrow morning.
Please rise, court will be in recess.
No, I don't mean that. I mean the testimony part.
Well, not yet. Well, I think I'll go home.
That's the only thing. I don't. That's the only possible thing that they could be talking about. The only possible thing that his interference charge would come from is on Cantwell's allegation as they walked out. He lunged at the struggle on the floor.
But Frazzini said,
But Frazzini said that didn't happen.
Lord. So they're running around, terrorizing my community, Before this particular arrest, I had seen him. He'd stopped me several times in, let's say, 3 weeks to maybe a month period.
Who?
Cantwell. Preceding that. Daytime, nighttime, Called me like black bastard, son of a bitch, Threatened to shoot me, dared me to fight him and all this kind of stuff,
Well, policemen are the minority. We are the minority as a whole. We get condemned for everything. We can't do nothing right. Whatever you do is wrong. No matter what it is, you're wrong. Well, I'll tell you this, crime rate's not going to stop under these conditions either. I mean, it's going to keep going and going and going until the people finally realize what type of a policeman you have to be to keep the crime rate down. As long as they want it this way, as long as they won't back you, crime rate's going to go. Every time you try and enforce it, you go the other way. Every time you stop somebody, harassment. I mean, first thing you bring up, officer, you're harassing me, you know. Well, I mean, that's not right. I mean, we're just doing our job.
There's problems out there. There are problems, and the police officers are the ones that have to deal with them, and they have to make snap judgments. And that's pretty difficult, because when I'm sitting up on the bench, sometimes I have to think and think. What really is the situation here? What really is the evidence? The officer doesn't have the time to thoroughly question all witnesses and make this decision. He has to make a snap judgment. To arrest or not to arrest, to give a complaint or not to. It's a hard decision to make.
You ever ridden in a police car?
Yes, on a few occasions when I first became a judge, and there's a very interesting story about that if I have enough time to tell you about it. I rode with a radar officer, who I think is one of the same officers you rode with. And while I was riding with him, some very interested citizen called up the dispatcher and said, car number such and such has a lady riding with it in the car. Very upset that an officer should have his girlfriend in the car. And so the call came over the air, Officer so-and-so, we have a report from a citizen that you have a lady in your car. Could you please let us know what the problem is? And the answer came right back without any thought. That's no lady, that's the judge.
Today's session of the trial began with Mr. Morgan, the prosecutor, trying to put in a simple little case. It went something like this. Officer Cantwell and some other policemen tried to arrest Mr. Watson. Mr. Watson ran into the filling station and then forcibly tried to prevent the officers from handcuffing him and taking him out. Ever since then, things have been getting more complicated. In cross-examination, Mr. Davies has been picking and pulling at the case, trying to find and suggest as many inconsistencies as he can. It has gotten confused with unexplained and unsettled points floating around. It's too early to know what is important and what isn't. If you're confused, you can be sure the jury is. I certainly am. Two other points are worth thinking about. The first relates to an issue that never formally gets into the trial, but is very much a part of the background of the case. Most of us know that policemen have broad discretion in making decisions, whether and how to make an arrest. Even if we accept the prosecutor's version of the facts here and put to one side any issue of personal or racial bias, we still must ask whether the great show of force by the police at the gas station was necessary and wise. I'm not suggesting that we try to decide now whether it was or it wasn't in this particular case. It's much more important that we consider whether we want to place on any policeman, with no guidance or control from the legislatures and often little or none from his own department, the burden of making this sort of decision on his own. A lot is at stake. It's not inconceivable that the events that led to this case could have triggered a riot. If, as citizens, we do have views on how we would want the scenario at 34th and Franklin to be played next time, and how we would want it played in our city and our neighborhood, we'd better think of ways those views can be expressed in legislation, in police department rules, and in police training materials and courses. If we do not, we will continue to rely on the legal system to try to sort out the facts and assign blame after it's all over. This leads to the second point. I think you can already get a sense of how small a part the parties whose actions led to the case play in the working out of it in court. The trial is the lawyer's show, and, to some extent, the judge's. If either side is badly represented, the theory of the adversary system breaks down, and the trial is unfair. If both are badly represented, it turns into a crap game. In many cities, good defense lawyers and prosecutors are simply overwhelmed by the increasing volume of cases. This is why lawyers, judges, and law teachers are so worried about the lack of able, well-trained criminal lawyers.
Okay. Car 214.
Maybe you'll take it up there.
214. 1931 Newport. Code 15 additional. I'm not a theft.
He's neat.
Okay.
He'll be back.
206. Hit and run. Car ran into a garage. 3350 Gaylord, okay. Attention all cars, reading the description of a wanted party, white male,
age 40 to 45. Height 6'2". 220 pounds, heavy build, medium complexion.